So it's a training day on the board for me today. Over the past week, I've just been out bouldering a few times and also training on the board, just trying to reintegrate myself into the world of climbing after a really busy period. And in my last vlog episode, I spoke about how I deal with really busy work periods. And I had a couple of really interesting questions and comments after that vlog. And one in particular stood out, especially because I'd just been thinking about this issue when I was running coaching sessions here in my wall last weekend. And that comment was about the demands of a very physical job versus a sedentary office type job. And the comment was that a lot of the discourse around training assumes that the climber will actually have a sedentary job, and so therefore they will have physical energy left over, if you will, for their training. But what about people who have very physically demanding jobs where they're actually quite physically tired at the end of the day, and they maybe don't have so much room for doing yet more physical effort? Actually, I think this issue is quite nuanced, and I think there's pros and cons to both types of job, both physical and sedentary. And in fact, my observation from my coaching sessions last week, I had 3 days of coaching with 6 climbers each day coming to this wall to train with me. And my observation was that those climbers who had physical jobs were almost universally the fittest, strongest and best climbers, with some exceptions, but as a general rule. And I thought that was really interesting. So what I noticed about those climbers who had physical jobs was that, generally speaking, they were physically healthy, had no underlying injuries, and were also just had good basic strength. They were strong guys. So it was really interesting to get the comment on my last vlog from someone who said that they were a rope access worker and spent long shifts hanging in a harness doing physical labour and didn't have much energy left at the end of the day for doing their climbing training. So I thought I would do a whole episode just exploring this issue and going through a bit of a list of points really of things that come to mind of how to deal with this. I mean, really the basic idea is to make the most of the advantages of having a physical job and mitigate the disadvantages of having a physical job, and the same vice versa for a sedentary job. Often those effects can be opposing, and so you're kind of adopting different strategies, if you like. But before we get to how to deal with the constraints of working within the job you've got, I should at least start off by talking about the possibility of doing a different job altogether. On the face of it, the simplest way to change your job circumstances is to leave your job and choose another one that suits your climbing goals and your general life balance better. Sometimes when I've been speaking about training in the past to audiences and I mention this possibility, there's an audible kind of intake of breath, because it's almost like, how can you mention that possibility? That's a step too far, as if that's dangerous ground to even make that point. So clearly for some people at least, it's quite a difficult thing to even consider. Far be it from me to make a comment about people's individual circumstances. Everyone's life is different. But with that said, I still think it's important to ask the question, that everyone should be able to ask the question themselves, even if the answer is no, that's not the right thing to do. The other important point to make is that if you do make a plan to change your job in order to make it fit your climbing goals or any other goal better, then you don't need to do it today or tomorrow or next month. You can build up to it over a long time. So having a long-term plan for where you want to go with your climbing is really, really a good idea. And the reason is that I've watched a lot of climbers who sometimes have asked me for coaching advice. They have broken themselves against a very difficult work-life balance schedule for many years before they finally decided to do things differently and start from scratch with a completely new routine. And for some of them at least, it might have worked out better if they'd taken that same decision just a good few years earlier. So with that aspect out of the way, let's move on to thinking about how you could change your existing work schedule to suit your climbing goals a little bit better. And the first thing I think is to think that you can change the conditions. Like, there is room to change, and If things are really stringent, then you maybe come back to the previous question of, is it really the right job? In many years of observing how other athletes, not just in climbing, but lots of different sports, have managed to change their work conditions, I've noticed one thing over and over again, is that the most single-minded and determined among them get over the fear of asking their employer, negotiating with their employer to change the conditions. Many of them have asked and asked and asked again, and thought up better conditions to work with their employer in order to negotiate things such as working from home, working remotely, changing their hours, sharing their job position, changing the location of their job. There are many, many variables you can change to make things work better, and really you are the best person to think what those are, and you are the best person to ask for them and to imagine how your job routine could work better for you. So my observation has been that those athletes who manage to make those changes, they go ahead and do that. They go ahead and do the imagining of how it could work better, and then make that case to their employer, and then negotiate quite forcefully until they get it. So there is an extent of not taking no for an answer, and I think that often will yield a good result in many cases, but certainly not in all. Another point I'd like to mention is that the same job in two different locations or situations will have quite different effects on your climbing ability or your ability to train for climbing. For example, living and working in a city is really not a great place if you're a rock climber. So you can do the same job, but if you live in the mountains or very close to the mountains, then you're able to get out and do some real climbing in your lunch hour. Or straight after work within 5 minutes or 10 minutes. But if you have to travel for hours, then often living in a city demands spending a lot of stressful hours commuting, then a lot of stressful hours commuting to the climbing wall, and then commuting home, and all of that adds to the total stress load, both physically and mentally, and takes away from what's left over to do meaningful training. So anything you can do to reduce that, the better. So I think first and foremost, basing yourself in the mountains, close to the climbing, it just makes life so much easier. The other thing that I think is underappreciated is that when you move out, cities are very saturated spaces. There's a lot of people competing for the same space, both in terms of physical space on the road to commute, but also the jobs that are there. Whereas in the mountains, there isn't that same competition. There are fewer places, but they are there. There is work there. And I mean, I experienced this when I first moved away from the city and moved to the mountains. And I watched lots of other friends do the same, and I could see that there is lots and lots of work and opportunities which tend to be really, really good. There's a lot of very good aspects about moving to the mountains. So it certainly carries my recommendation if you want to do well in climbing, but also work in a good environment that suits your whole life routine. So why would two people who do a very physically demanding job have quite different outcomes in their climbing? One person finds it very hard, very exhausting, very hard to have energy left over to train, and the other actually just is very strong and fit and capable and finds it just fine. Well, I would say the most important component is the total allostatic load, the total life load, if you will. So the person that gets on poorly and the job breaks them is the person who, on top of the job, they also have a long commute. They also have a very busy home life that really has too many things going on in it. That person maybe stays up late at night, drinks alcohol, has a poor diet, all these other things that just add on top. And these can be quite difficult to detect because they're normal activities. These days, everyone sits and spends a lot of time on social media. But if you have a long day job, a long shift, and then you're going to try and train on top of that, you can't then add more on top without negative consequences. So having a mind to the total allostatic load and respecting that and not exceeding it really pays off. Meanwhile, the climber who gets up at the same time in the morning, goes to bed early every night without exceptions really, eats a good diet, has minimal other outside stressors or activities that just add up to being to just too much, that respects their circadian regulation. That is, they're not looking at screens too late at night, they're not eating too late at night. They are the people who will adapt quite quickly to their job and be able to handle that and additional training on top of that. Now, for people with a very sedentary job, they can almost have the opposite problem, where the other thing that's really, that's just as unhealthy as constant activity that you can't recover from is no activity at all followed by bursts of really intense activity. So often those people have to work to integrate more activity into their daily routine, so that they're mitigating the effects of sitting on their ass, getting weak, and having other things like postural problems and all the things that go with a sedentary lifestyle. So those people are really going to benefit from taking their fingerboard to work and doing their fingerboard session in the lunch hour, going out for a run, doing some basic body strength exercises during their lunch hour or before they leave in the morning. Really just trying to avoid having long stints of doing absolutely nothing and then trying to squeeze all of your training tasks into this one session, probably when you're a little bit tired at the end of the night. Another good tactic really for all climbers, regardless of the type of work that they do, is to train first and work later. That is, to get up in the morning and train rather than wait till after your work session. More and more climbing walls support this. They have early opening hours to go in first, and that can be a great time when everything's really quiet and you can have a really focused training session and do a lot of work in a short amount of time, without any distractions. Another tactic is really just to try your best to harness good aspects of the job. Sometimes people during their work shift have some periods of downtime where they're really not doing much, and harnessing them to do a bit of training in those short windows can be really, really good. And again, that portable fingerboard can come with you anywhere. It can be hung off a van, off a steel bar in a big building, in a corporate building, off a tree, off anything you like. You can get the training done. The next aspect is about the short and long-term programming of the job. So many of the climbers that I've observed to have physical jobs, such as rope access workers, they do really, really well when they do stints of work for a couple of weeks, even if it's away from home, followed by stints of a couple of weeks where they're not working at all. So really, if you can use those times to go climbing as much as possible when you're off work. So when you're away from home and you're working, if you have a very disciplined mindset and you're using every spare moment to go to the gym or anywhere that you have access to do some training, and you're also very, very disciplined with your diet, you can come back from your work trip with really good in really good physical shape, and then integrate that back into your climbing when you've got the chance to go out and do some rock climbing. And I've seen many friends use this strategy to great effect, and they're like machines. I also know other climbers who do it completely differently. They work 6 months of the year very hard and then don't work at all for the other 6 months of the year. There are 1,000,001 ways of doing it. For everyone, including myself, like I was saying in my last post, there are periods where your workload exceeds the allostatic, the total load that you can cope with. And you're really kind of overreaching at that point. You have very limited capacity to absorb further training and actually have a response to it that's positive. Really, if you do further training on top of that, it's more likely to injure you than anything else. So what do you do in that period? Well, you just scale the training right down. Less is more with training in these periods. And I sometimes feel that climbers are afraid to do very, very little training. And so they'll often either continue to train too much and just get injured, or they'll actually do nothing at all and go backwards, whereas somewhere in between might be the sweet spot, where you do that high priority, very minimal amount of training. It can even be a few climbs. Sometimes I come in here and I just do my warm-up and then stop, or sometimes I come in and just do a handful of hangs on the fingerboard, and that's it. Again, in my first episode of my vlog, I talked about a 10-minute workout, which is just that hits that high priority stuff. But really the overarching point is there's no prizes for overreaching what your body can handle. If you go too hard, then you just break. And unfortunately for many people, it's hard not to fall into the trap of just living like that for a week, and then it becomes a month, and then it becomes a year, and then it becomes a decade. I guess generally what I'm trying to say is that the goal is to game the system. You know, many aspects of Western society and lifestyle, and especially jobs, the system is set up for their benefit, not for yours. And your goal to maximise your own performance is to try and shift that balance back in your favour. And you might need to find some pretty inventive ways of doing it, but often it can be done. You know, you can move the needle quite a lot in the direction that favours your routine. And it's funny, I mean, in my own experience, I feel that this is a bit of a mindset, and that once you take a decision like that once, then it becomes easy. You can't help but to do it in many other aspects of your life. And in my opinion, it really reaps some big advantages. And in my mind, this whole issue comes down to uncertainty and the hold that it tends to have over people. So sure, if you make some big changes in your life and your work routine, then some things could go awry. It's possible, you know, until you take further action and fix them. But there is a bit of an irony, really, that we share this activity of climbing, which is really based around adventure, which is uncertainty by definition, and yet as climbers we could be so averse to the uncertainty of making a change in our everyday lifestyle. And I think that once you get over any aversion to uncertainty in that sphere, then it's possible you might actually start to relish that uncertainty, because although it brings the possibility of change that you might have to fix, you know, some negative things, it also brings the possibility that things could be much, much better.